The silo standing at the edge of County Road 4 had been written off by everyone who'd ever looked at First Saline Bank's foreclosure file on the Eddy place. Old structure, the property preservation contract read, condition unknown, scheduled for clearance. Nobody who wrote those words had ever once asked whose name was actually on the deed to the ground that silo stood on. Darla Quint could have told them. Her grandfather built that silo in 1962, and by 4 in the morning on a Thursday in March of 2024, it no longer existed. Mervyn Stoltz heard the engines first, from his own kitchen across the road, before he ever saw the dust catching the yard light. He'd known Vernon Quint, and then Roy Quint, and now Darla, the better part of 60 years between the three of them, and he says he understood, standing at his window in the dark in his stocking feet, that whatever was happening over there wasn't going to wait politely for sunrise to make sense of itself. He called Darla before he'd even found his boots. This is the kind of story my father would have told slow, at his own kitchen table, with all the names left in. If yours did too, this channel is built for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. Saline County, Nebraska sits in the kind of ground that rewards patience more than almost anything else a person could bring to it. Black loam corn and soybean country, a little south and west of Lincoln. The kind of county where a family's name can sit on a single piece of paper in a courthouse drawer for 60 years, without anybody bothering to read it twice. Vernon Quint poured the footings for that silo himself in the spring of 1962. A 40,000-bushel structure standing on a little under an acre and a half at the edge of what was then 401 acres of Quint family row crop ground outside Wilbur. He used it to dry and store his own corn rather than hauling green grain straight to the elevator at harvest, a habit that saved the family real money most years, and one his son, Roy, kept up without much modification for the better part of 3 decades after him. The original bin carried a faded Balin nameplate near the door, the steel company that built half the grain storage in that part of the state back in the 60s. The kind of detail nobody but Darla and Mervyn would have ever thought to notice. Earl Voborel, who ran the co-op elevator in Wilbur for going on 25 years and had weighed in every load of Quint corn that didn't go through Vernon's own bin first, used to tell people the Quints were about the only family left in the county still running grain the old patient way. Instead of dumping it straight off the combine, he kept a standing offer open to Darla every fall, the same one he'd kept open for Roy before her, to buy at harvest price rather than wait. And she'd turned it down most years, the same as her father had, content to bet on her own bin and her own patience over whatever the elevator board was posting that week. Roy Quint sold the surrounding 400 acres to a neighbor, Wallace Eddy. In the fall of 1998, a clean transaction by most measures, except for the one thing Roy insisted on in writing before he'd sign anything. The deed carved out a little under 1.5 acres at the northeast corner of the property, the silo and the ground directly under it, by precise metes and bounds, reserved entirely to the Quint family regardless of who owned everything around it. Roy didn't trust handshake arrangements about ground that mattered to him, not after watching his own father get burned once by a verbal understanding that turned out to mean nothing once it reached a courthouse. He hired his own surveyor. He hired his own attorney. He sat across the closing table from Wallace Eddy 3 separate times before the language read exactly the way he wanted it to read, and only then did he sign anything. The 1998 deed recorded that carve out in plain language, indexed and filed at the Saline County Courthouse, same as every Quint deed going back to 1962. Available to anybody who cared to pull the file. Nobody at First Saline Bank ever pulled it. Wallace Eddy financed an operating loan against the property in 2019 and refinanced it again in 2021. And both times the legal description attached to the paperwork had simply been copied forward from an older, pre-1998 plat reference, the kind of shortcut a busy loan processor takes when nothing on the surface suggests a problem worth double-checking. A legal description copied once is convenient. Copied twice, across two separate closings 6 years apart, it starts to look less like an oversight and more like a habit nobody ever thought to break. Two different loan officers had handled those two closings, neither one aware the other had made the same assumption 6 years apart. The description on file at the bank still showed all 401 original acres, silo included, as though the 1998 carve-out had never happened at all. Wallace Eddy defaulted in the fall of 2023, 2 bad crop years running on top of debt he'd taken on expanding equipment a few seasons earlier. And First Saline Bank foreclosed that winter, taking the property into its own real estate-owned inventory that February. Wallace himself had moved to Lincoln by then, taken a job at a farm supply distributor, and had no particular reason to think about the silo lot one way or the other. He'd always known it belonged to the Quints, same as everybody else along that road did, and had simply assumed, the same as the bank apparently had, that whoever handled his loan paperwork would have sorted out a detail that obvious. Nobody had asked him either. The bank hired a property preservation contractor, Heartland Property Solutions, to clear what its own file described as abandoned structures ahead of a spring resale. And nobody along that chain, not the loan officer, not the contractor, not the man running the track hoe, had any particular reason to believe the silo standing near the road belonged to anybody other than the bank. Darla Quint had 28,000 bushels of corn sitting in that silo the night the crew arrived. Grain she was holding back from a soft fall market in hopes of a better spring price. The same patient calculation her grandfather had taught her father, and her father had eventually taught her. She'd farmed 600 acres of her own ground for the better part of 2 decades by then, separate entirely from what Wallace Eddy had bought in 1998, but had always kept the silo running the way Roy had, because selling stored grain on her own schedule instead of the elevators had put real money in her pocket more years than not. She'd never married, never had children of her own to pass any of it down to, and had taken to telling people, half joking, that the farm itself had turned out to be a fairly demanding kind of family all on its own. The canvas folder lived in a fireproof box in her office closet, every deed and tax statement organized by year, a habit she'd inherited directly from Roy, who kept his own version of the same box for as long as she could remember. She got to the property a little before 5 that morning, Mervin's phone call still ringing in her ears, headlights catching the dust still hanging in the air before she'd even pulled off the road. The silo was already down, a flattened ring of corrugated steel and 28,000 bushels of corn spilled across ground her family had owned outright since before her own father was born. The grain pile steaming faintly in the cold the way fresh spilled corn does, a smell she'd known her whole life now attached to something that made her stomach turn instead of her mouth water. The track hoe sat idling a few yards off, its operator climbing down to confer with somebody on a radio, none of them paying her truck much attention as she pulled in. The crew was moving toward the pole barn next, the same parcel, the same mistaken paperwork driving them forward without anybody having stopped to ask a single question first. "That's my ground," Darla told the contractor's foreman, standing between his equipment and the barn with a canvas folder under her arm. "Every deed since 1962 says so, and I've got every one of them right here. Barn's not coming down. Not today, not on this paperwork. Not raised voice, not a single curse word, though she'd have been within her rights to use a few. Just a flat, level statement of fact, delivered the way her father used to deliver bad news to a bank himself, back when the boot had been on the other foot. The foreman, a man named Kurt Halloran, who'd been handed a work order and a parcel map that morning and nothing more, looked at her the way a man looks at a problem nobody briefed him on. He wasn't unkind about it. He just didn't have the authority to stop on the word of a woman with a folder, not without a call to somebody above him first. He made that call. Phil Garner, first Celine Bank's vice president of special assets, drove out himself within the hour, still in the flannel shirt he'd thrown on when his phone rang at 5 in the morning. And to his credit, he didn't argue with what Darla laid out on the tailgate of her truck, the 1962 deed to Vernon Quint. The 1998 warranty deed with the carve-out described in precise metes and bounds, and continuous Saline County tax statements running unbroken from 1962 to the present, every single one assessing that acre and a half separately under the Quint name, never once folded into whatever parcel Wallace Eddy had been paying taxes on. Garner wasn't dismissive. Not exactly. Or maybe he was. For the first few minutes, the particular dismissiveness of a man whose morning had already gone badly enough that one more problem felt like something he could talk his way past. He stopped talking his way past it somewhere around the second deed. He read the 1998 deed twice, standing in the cold with Darla's folder open across the tailgate, and admitted, plain, that he honestly didn't know how a description that wrong had survived 2 separate loan closings without anybody catching it. He called the bank's attorney from the tailgate itself, right there in front of her, and told the contractor to stand down for the day before he'd even hung up. Vernon Quint never explained much about why the silo mattered to him beyond the plain economics of it. But Roy understood, better than anybody, what his father had actually been protecting. Not the structure itself, exactly, just the principle that a man's own ground, paid for and recorded, didn't become negotiable simply because somebody else's paperwork got sloppy. Darla remembered her father telling her once, the two of them standing at the base of the silo on a cold morning, much like the one that would eventually take it down, that a deed was the only promise a man could make that didn't depend on anybody else's memory staying honest. People forget. People die. People sell a piece of ground to somebody who sells it to somebody else. And somewhere down that line, a piece of paper is the only thing left standing between what's true and what's merely assumed. Roy carried that same conviction into the 1998 sale, refusing 3 separate offers from Wallace Eddy to simply leave the silo lot folded into the larger transaction for a slightly higher price, holding out instead for the carve-out language his own lawyer drew up by hand. Wallace had grumbled about it at the time. By most accounts, thought Roy was being stubborn over a structure that barely mattered to the bigger sale. But he signed it anyway because the rest of the deal was fair, and he wanted the ground more than he wanted to argue. Roy died in 2015, 81 years old, of complications from a stroke he'd never fully recovered from, having spent the last decade of his life mostly content to watch Darla run both the silo and her own ground with the same patience he'd practiced his whole life. He never imagined, she said later, that the paper he'd fought so hard to get right would end up mattering quite this much. Nor that it would take a bulldozer at 4 in the morning to prove he'd been right to insist on it. First Celine Bank's title work, once its own legal department finally reviewed the full chain going back to 1962, confirmed everything Darla's folder already showed. Garner called her himself 4 days later to deliver the news, rather than letting a letter do it, which Darla noted at the time, and has mentioned more than once since as the one part of the whole ordeal the bank actually got right, without being pushed into it. The bank accepted full liability within 2 weeks, no litigation required, and agreed to a settlement covering a new 40,000 bushel steel bin from a different manufacturer this time. C rather than the discontinued bail-in line, installed at $215,000, plus $135,800 for the lost corn at the spring market price, plus an additional sum covering Darla's legal fees and the cost of clearing the wreckage. the total settlement running to just over $365,000. The bank also rewrote its property preservation procedures that summer, requiring a current title search against the actual recorded plat, not the file copy, before any structure scheduled for demolition could be cleared. Darla Quint is 55 this year. The new bin went up that June, a few feet from where the old one stood, and holds corn from both her own ground and, as of last fall, a small custom storage arrangement with 2 younger farmers in the county who didn't have bins of their own. She still drives the same Chevy Silverado she bought in 2014, still parks it in the same spot near the office where Roy used to park his, and still keeps the original folder, the same canvas one she carried out to the tailgate that morning, in the same drawer in the farm office where Roy used to keep it. She has added a few documents of her own to it since, including a copy of the bank's written apology, which she keeps behind the 1998 deed rather than in front of it. A small detail nobody but her would think to notice or care about. Mervyn Stoltz still tells the story standing at the same kitchen window where he first heard the engines that morning. The new bin visible now where the old one used to be. He says the bank wasn't cruel, just careless in a way that had been quietly compounding since 1998. Waiting for somebody to finally open the right file. He says paper outlasts paperwork, plain as anybody could say it, and that a man who insists on getting the carve-out right, even when it costs him a better offer, is doing more for the people who come after him than he usually gets credit for at the time. Earl Voberl still weighs in Darla's corn at the co-op most years she sells, rather than stores, and still tells customers, when the subject comes up, that the Quints were never the kind of family you wanted to bet against on a question of paperwork. Kurt Halloran, the foreman who stood his ground that morning until the call came through, still works property preservation for the same contractor, and says it's the one job site he's ever worked where being wrong turned out to be the easiest 5 minutes of an otherwise terrible day. Vernon Quint poured the footings for that silo in 1962 without any way of knowing what it would cost a bank. 2 years later, to learn what was written on the deed underneath it.